Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the box was cardboard, the detective was dying, and the bridge was Thor, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
Have you ever stopped to wonder why James Phillimore disappeared looking for his umbrella? Or just how parsley can manage to sink into the butter?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 313, The Home Life of Henry Baker. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in some of the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, how's home life these days?
Oh, home life. It's where the heart is. Absolutely fabulous.
Where the hearth is?
Home and hearth and heart. Home is where the heart, yeah, absolutely.
Heart to heart, yeah. Well, this is, it's that time of year. This is our final episode in Season 6 of Trifles. We are wrapping things up here in December. Of course, we're going to come back next month for Season 7.
Wait a minute. We're coming back next month?
Would you believe it? You didn't get, I'm sorry, you didn't get the contract notice.
I didn't get the memo from the chief operating officer.
Well, maybe your contract isn't being extended.
Oh,
We're trading you for a podcaster to be named later.
I must call my attorney and thank him.
You and me both, brother.
Yeah.
No, of course we're both coming back for Season 7. We're going to continue this little fun project we set out on some 7 years ago. It seems astounding that we've been able to keep it up for this long and not run out of topics. And part of that is we have our great listeners to thank, as you've been suggesting topics for us to pursue or to investigate. And we also have the wonder of all of the Sherlockians who have gone before us, as we have looked every month at some of these, as we call them, Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes. We look at prior scholarship, and the master's class episodes where we look at exemplary scholarship. And I think that's something that you'll hear us continue into Season 7, so stay tuned for that. But of course, if you have suggestions for us, we'd always like to hear from you. You can email us simply at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com, or of course you can leave us a comment on any of the show notes. The show notes for this episode are at ihose.co/trifles313, and that will take you directly to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website. You can also find these links in the notes section of the podcast app that you may happen to listen to us on. And there you can sign up for email updates for when new episodes come out, and you can become a Patreon supporter, where we will give you additional bonus content that the general public does not have, and we'll give you access to listening to the shows ad-free. So simply check us out on Patreon right there in the show notes. Well, I mentioned 'tis the season, typically December 27th of every year. Falls, as it does, 2 days after Christmas. And that is when the Blue Carbuncle began. And, I think there's some wonderful traditions in the Sherlockian world where we celebrate the Blue Carbuncle. But Bert, what are your carbuncling Sherlockian traditions around this time of the year?
Well, not many. I always, yeah, it was observed years ago. I think Christopher Morley suggested that President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, rather than reading A Christmas Carol to his children at Christmas, which apparently was, or was rumored to be, I don't know if it was an actual fact, a custom of the Roosevelt household, but instead, FDR should have read the Blue Carbuncle to his children. I've never read the Carbuncle to my children, although I've certainly recommended it to them to read. But for myself, I go back and I reread Christopher Morley's essay about the Carbuncle, which I really enjoy. And really.
Yeah.
And also, obviously, take a look at the story again, flip through.
Yeah, and we did a special episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Gosh, may have been our very first season, where we did a discussion or a reading about that essay. And I still remember you reading parts of it. And we'll have, actually, I'll put a link to that. I think we have a playlist, a Blue Carbuncle playlist on SoundCloud. I'll put together in the show notes.
Oh, nice.
Because we do have other carbuncling episodes. Of course, I think our very first year here on Trifles, our last episode of the season was called The Second Morning After Christmas, or The Second Day After Christmas. And we talked about the folly of hiding a gem in a piece of poultry. And then just recently, episode 310, we talked about the route of the Blue Carbuncle around London as it changed hands and went back and forth. So, myself, I like to, if I do have the time amid the harried schedule around here, I like to read it. But I also put on the wonderful Bert Coull's BBC radio production with Clive Marison and Michael Williams on my CD player. I play that as I wrap presents in my office. And it's a wonderful way, because I think Bert has done just a tremendous job of creating the universe, the atmosphere of the Blue Carbuncle, absent some of the dialogue and detail that must have gone on, that Watson simply does not provide us with.
Oh, I very much agree. In fact, the lovely thing that Bert Coull's and Clive Marison and Michael Williams did in that recording was they added dialogue. They added a lovely emotional touch, and it really rings true to the spirit not only of the characters but to the voice of Conan Doyle, and in so doing made the story that much richer and made that particular audio performance, that play, really little play that it is, just much more satisfying. Just beautifully, beautifully done. That's a lovely thing to listen to.
Yeah, and I think between the threatening tone of the police inspector who was trying to get information out of John Horner, the dialogue between Horner and his wife, and this extends into the Granada series as well. The dialogue between Henry Baker and the proprietor of the Alpha Inn, all of these things round out these backstories that we're not exposed to, but we have to imagine. And I think the writers did a wonderful job with that. And in the spirit of that, as I was thinking about the Blue Carbuncle and these backstories, I wondered what the home life of Henry Baker might have been. This poor, sad sack of an individual who lost his hat, lost his goose on the way home, Christmas Eve. And of course, the goose had that tag on it that said, "For Mrs. Henry Baker," clearly a gift. But what do we think we can gather about the home life of Henry Baker, particularly with all of those deductions that Holmes made from the hat?
Well, we can, as Holmes does, we have got this wonderful scene in the case where Watson looks at the hat and doesn't come to really any great conclusions. He generally describes it. And then Holmes says, you're not drawing enough inferences. You're not logically pursuing the implications of what you're observing. And then Holmes goes on to paint this remarkable scene of someone whose wife has ceased to love him as an example. And so taking all of that true, you can imagine Henry Baker to be someone who's come down in the world, someone who has never made a tremendous amount of money, is living in poverty or near poverty, this goose with the tag on it, a gift, to Mrs. Henry Baker, is supposed to be a big item at the holiday, something that has great significance in the household. And that one would think that Mrs. Baker, may well look back upon her marriage to Henry and say to herself, that I didn't choose particularly wisely, and there may be less affection between the couple today than there was certainly some years ago, and a general sad state of affairs. Baker is sort of a shabby person. You can't imagine that as the year comes to a close in the Henry Baker household, there's much wonder to be looking forward to. But we could always be wrong, but sadly, I think that's what I imagine.
Yeah, I think you're probably onto something there. I mean, he did have some good years, I think. Certainly the purchase of so fine a hat and the addition of a hat securer on it meant that he was certainly flush enough to be able to afford something like that, although now he hasn't replaced the elastic that has snapped. He's repaired the hat or tried to at least care for the hat in a way that involves placing ink over some of the stains. He's got tallow stains on it. His wife doesn't brush the hat, so it's a little dusty, which, again, Holmes inferred that his wife has ceased to love him. The additional factor there that Holmes with this it is a guess, but it's an informed guess because you put all these things together, and that is that Henry Baker has turned to drink, and part of that is because of the decline in his fortunes. The other part, very obviously, is he frequented the Alpha Inn, a public house, and that's where he belonged to the Goose Club. So, you don't become a Goose Club member without being some sort of regular at a public house. And let's face it too, drinking at a public house is more expensive than drinking at home. So that must have added to his financial woes as well. And I'm sure Mrs. Baker was not thrilled with that kind of situation.
No, I think that's a fair statement.
But he probably went there to avoid her too. Oh, I know.
All these tropes.
And I think it was wonderfully imagined in the Granada production when Mr. Baker is making his final payment on the bird, and he pulls the shillings out of his pocket, and there's this wonderful exchange between he and is it Mr. Windigate? No, that's not the proprietor of the Alpha Inn. I'm thinking.
No, you're thinking about Case of Identity.
Case of Identity. No, that's Windibank. No, Windigate was Alpha Inn, wasn't it? And Windigate. Let me see. Yeah, Windigate. Yeah. Not Windibank. So here's that exchange, and it's actually capped with a very droll observation by Henry Baker.
Struck it rich, have we, Mr. Baker?
I chanced upon an acquaintance of sympathetic disposition. That is to say, I sold some of my books.
Not your books, Mr. Baker.
Needs must, Mr. Windigate, and at this season of the year more than ever, we must not deprive those we love. Or even those to whom we are married.
Yeah, to those whom we love or to whom we are married. It's kind of a sad state of affairs. But, he was bringing home this goose as kind of a peace offering. Or so he thought. Until he wasn't. So the particular poignant part of that dialogue there, and it was wonderfully reflected in the music by Patrick Gowers. Baker mentions that he happened upon an old acquaintance and he sold some of his books, and you hear the music come up there with Silent Night in kind of a woeful, soulful tone. And it's sad. You know, here is a man of intellectual capacity, and he tells us in the story that there are a few of us who frequent the Alpha Inn near the museum. We are to be found in the museum itself during the day, you understand. So he's an academic of some sort. He's or someone who at least appreciates study. And here he had to sell his books to make his final payment on this Christmas gift to his wife.
Very sad, very sad.
So, well, speaking of sad, let's take a quick break here so you can enjoy the wonders from our sponsor. The Baker Street Journal was first published in 1946, and its old series extended through 1949. It picked up again in 1951 and has been publishing ceaselessly every quarter since then. Every issue of the BSJ is packed with top-notch papers that reflect the sensibilities of Sherlockians from throughout the world. They might be scholarly in nature, giving us details on an aspect of Victorian life that maybe we weren't aware of. They might be tongue-in-cheek, that approach to the game where we wink at each other as we acknowledge Dr. Watson as the true author of the stories and try to figure out some inconsistency. Or they might be something that we never thought was related to Sherlock Holmes, and the author brings it all together for us. Whatever the approach, they're all represented in the Baker Street Journal. Plenty of varying opinions and researches on the world of Sherlock Holmes. Make sure you get on the subscription list to get your copy of the Baker Street Journal delivered to your mailbox every quarter by going to bakerstreetirregulars.com today. Okay, we're back talking about the home life of Henry Baker. Now, Bert, you and I were talking before the show began about a real-life inspiration for Henry Baker that may provide a little bit of insight into his backstory.
It's interesting, really. And the spark for this is Christopher Morley, at least for me. In 1918, there was a collection of Christopher Morley's essays brought together called Shandygaff. And in the dedication of the book, Morley writes, I wanted to call these exercises, and these are lots of his smaller newspaper columns and observations that are a lot of fun to read. I wanted to call these exercises, he writes, casual ablutions, in memory of the immortal sign in the washroom of the British Museum. You remember that George Gissing, homeless and penniless on London streets, used to enjoy the lavatory of the museum reading room as a fountain and a shrine. But the trustees, finding him using the washstand for bathtub and laundry, set up this notice: these basins are for casual ablutions only. And that reminded me that Saul Cohen wrote an essay in the Baker Street Journal in June of 1975, volume 25, number 2, suggesting that Henry Baker was really George Gissing. And he points out that in 1940, Vincent Starrett, in his introduction to Baker Street and Beyond, Starrett wrote, just around the corner from Baker Street in the Marylebone Road in 1884 lived George Gissing. And Gissing was a contemporary of Conan Doyle. He lived in poverty for most of his life. When he was at university, unfortunately, stole from his fellow students when he ran out of money. He was discovered, prosecuted, spent a month at hard labor, went to the States, became a newspaper reporter for a while, came back to England, never lived very, very prosperously, and became a rather sad figure. He knew George Meredith, he knew H.G. Wells, and in fact, Morley, in the 1957 Christmas annual of the Baker Street Journal, wrote, I've not had time to run down all my research, but I had a wonderful tip lately that Henry Baker, who was degoosed on Tottenham Court Road, was in actuality George Gissing, who was living in a basement not far from Goodge Street about that time. And that's one reason why Holmes did not prosecute the thief, for fear of painful publicity for poor George Gissing. The depiction Watson gives of Henry Baker's manner and garb is exact to our knowledge of poor Gissing. And so, it's interesting for those of us who sort of dabble in and out of Victorian literature to think about Gissing being this Baker character.
That's really, there's a lot wrapped up there. It's really interesting. Really sad. No social safety nets back then, so people were left to their own devices, and it sounds like Gissing really struggled for quite some time. But the thing that strikes me as fundamentally different about him and Henry Baker, yes, they both fell on hard times, but it sounds like from Gissing's origins there was some malevolence there, a willingness to make off with the property of others. And I don't think we get that kind of sense from Henry Baker at all. If anything, he's a victim, having his property been made off with and being the victim of unfortunate circumstances and of his own vices. But I don't think he took advantage of anyone.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very useful distinction. There is a comment about Gissing by H.G. Wells, because, as I say, Gissing knew Wells. And in fact, Wells and his wife at the time spent some time with Gissing. And Wells said, in 1897, Gissing was no longer the glorious, indefatigable, impracticable youth of the London flat, but a damaged and ailing man, full of ill-advised precautions against imaginary illnesses that were his interpretations of a general malaise. Oof.
Don't want to cross that guy.
No,
clearly.
Sad.
It is sad. Well, given that Henry Baker was in such a destitute state, and had resorted to wearing a Scotch bonnet instead of his usual hat, and coupling that with the notion that the Countess of Morcar was offering a reward for the return of the Blue Carbuncle, I wonder if Henry Baker ever saw part of that reward. And I don't recall us ever talking about that as a trifle, the reward for the Blue Carbuncle. I don't know if it warrants its own episode, but I think we talked about it at somewhere along the way. Maybe it was over on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. But so she offered this reward. Holmes kept the diamond, quote unquote, in his museum. I would imagine that Commissioner Peterson probably wanted to make a claim on it. Now, Henry Baker was none the wiser for the carbuncle's existence, but if Holmes turned the carbuncle in, and let's recall that at the end of the episode, the end of the story, he said the solution is its own reward. Well, of course it's its own reward when you're actually turning the gem in for the actual reward. Perhaps he split it with Peterson and then gave some portion to Henry Baker as well to help him through these tough times.
Oh, I like that. I like that as an idea. That's a very Holmesian thing to do. In his essay, Morley had some observations about what happened to the reward money, pointing out that Holmes had a lot of out-of-pocket expenses during the case of the carbuncle. But I like that a lot. I like to think that Henry Baker received a check in the post from Sherlock Holmes that was a far greater reward than the value of that particular goose, which, of course, he also did get his goose replaced. So
That is true.
it wasn't a disaster for Henry Baker by any means.
I wonder what the reaction was at home when Henry Baker came back with his goose 2 days late, or 3 days late, however many days transpired there. It was clearly after Christmas to his wife.
Well, the other side of this, too, is his wife could have, sort of gone beyond Henry and be operating a very profitable and useful business of her own, and that's why she's got no time to brush his hat. So,
She's busy brushing the goose.
yeah, she's busy, with her business affairs. Poor old Henry's got to brush his own hat.
Yeah. Well, the good news is, after all this is said and done, Mrs. Henry Baker probably got a feather duster out of it.
And a feather duster is a very minor thing, after all. It's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes. But I fail to see why you should get so warm over a trifle.